For today's video, I want to talk about the different types of aquarium plants available in the hobby to help newcomers choose the best options for their tanks. I've lost count of the number of times that people have reached out to me wondering why their plants are melting, only to find out that they've picked the wrong type or chosen plants that are far too difficult for their specific aquarium. This often leads to wasted money and unnecessary stress as they try to figure out where they went wrong. Now, I do have a pretty hefty accompanying article to this video that I link to in the description, where it has all of the plant names I'll be recommending spelled out if you want to try and search them to buy in your area, and I also link to all of my plant care guides for a lot of those plants in that article too. So getting into the video, and the first plant type that I want to talk about are Rhizome Plants, and this is what I class as the gold standard for beginner-friendly plants in the hobby. These are easy to recognise by their horizontally grown tuber-like rhizome which the leaves and roots sprout from. Most hobbyists use these as epiphyte plants, attaching them to rocks or driftwood or other aquarium decorations with things like thread or aquarium-safe glue rather than planting them directly in the substrate. That said, technically you can plant the roots in the substrate, and provided the rhizome is above the substrate level there should be enough water flow to keep it healthy, but that is adding risk. Personally, I'd always say get them on some hardscape. This makes them especially beginner friendly since you don't need to worry about choosing the right substrate, and it also helps drastically reduce costs. In my experience, rhizome plants usually grow at a very slow to medium rate depending on the specific variety that you choose for your tank. Now, this might sound like a drawback because it takes longer for the plants to fill in, but it can also be a big benefit for a lot of people who are looking for low maintenance plants that rarely need trimming. On top of that, a lot of rhizome plants absolutely thrive under very low light, such as the stock lights that are included with a lot of entry-level kit tanks, and they don't require CO2 injection or any liquid fertilizers. Because of that, they can do extremely well with the fish poop fertilization method, and I link to my article going over that method in the description. Now, I'm a big fan of rhizome plants and I've tried quite a few, but out of all of the ones that I've personally kept, the most beginner-friendly option by far are varieties of the Anubias barteri species. While most people in the hobby simply use the word Anubias to describe these, it is important to note that Anubias is actually an entire genus of plants. There's other species within that genus such as Afzelii and a few others that can technically work in submerged aquariums, but they usually do better above the water, whereas Anubias barteri converts to submerged life extremely well. A few of my favourite and widely available varieties of the Anubias barteri species are Anubias barteri varbarteri, Anubias coffeefolia, Anubias callidifolia, Anubias coinleaf, and Anubias nana. Those plants have all been extremely hardy and easy to keep, and a lot of people in the hobby jokingly call them plastic plants that grow because they are so hard to have issues with. Java fern is another common recommendation for beginners, but while it can work well, it does seem to be temperamental depending on the specific setup, so personally I wouldn't recommend you go out and buy a lot of them if you are new to the hobby. My advice would be to try one single Java fern, give it at least 3 months in your tank to see if it's going to melt before you buy any more, just in case you have issues with your setup, and it helps keeps your wastage down with your financial investment for your plants. Bucephalandra is another great option that's very popular in the hobby, and while it can be very easy to grow in my tanks, even the ones that have Sirius stone in them slightly increase in water hardness, I have seen other people say that if they have very hard water the plant can melt. Now, this can be a common issue for people new to the planted tank side of the hobby because they don't actually know what type of water they have coming out of their tap, but you can use the free Kinetico postcode checker if you're here in the UK. You simply put your postcode in, press enter, and it will give you your water hardness for your area, keeping things simple. I link to that tool in the video description, but if you live in a different country, I'm sure there's similar tools available for you too. There's also Bulbitis, which is another rhizome option, and there's a few different options in the hobby, but personally I've only ever kept Bulbitis hedioloti, and in my tanks it has been very easy to grow without CO2 using entry-level lighting, but again I have seen people saying hard water setups this one can melt too. Propagation of rhizome plants is also very simple, and once the plant is established in your tank and the rhizome has grown long enough, you can simply cut it in two and divide it into two separate plants. Now, I have done this a few times with Anubias in my own fish room, but if I'm honest, it grows so slow and it takes so long for this to be a realistic option for people in the hobby to do. I usually just buy new Anubias when I need it for more tanks. The main use case for rhizome plants in the hobby is to improve the aesthetics of your aquarium and add pops of colour to your hardscape. That said, the larger varieties of Anubias barteri, Java fern and bulbitis can also get big enough to add plenty of hiding spots for your fish to reduce stress, while also adding a lot of surface area for your shrimp and snails to graze on algae that grows on them. Next up, we have rhizome plants, which I personally consider the second most beginner-friendly group of plants available in the hobby. Many of their beginner-friendly varieties are highly adaptable and can thrive in a wide range of different aquarium setups. Rhizome plants are very easy to recognise because they cluster their leaves around a central point where they all grow from, and there's a bunch of different varieties available in the hobby to keep things easy and offer a lot of variety. Now, there is a common myth that a lot of popular rosette plants in the hobby are heavy root feeders, but this has been disproven time and time again. The truth is, most beginner-friendly species grow just fine using the fish poop fertilization method, and while they can pull nutrients from the substrate, it's not essential, so you don't need an expensive, highly nutrient-rich substrate. That said, most people will still plant their rosette plants directly in the substrate of their tank, but some of them can be used as epiphytes with ease. A standout example of this is Schismatoglottis protoi, which can do very well either rooted in the substrate or attached to the rocks and driftwood in your aquarium, as I'm using it in this clip. Its small size makes it great for detail and hardscape in smaller nano tanks, but it can also work well in larger tanks if needed. Personally, I'd use it in the same way that I'd use something like Anubias petite or any of the smaller Bucephalandra varieties, as it is very small and usually stays under 5 inches or 2 centimeters. Now, growth rates for rhizome plants can vary widely, even in the same tank, depending on the specific variety that you choose to get. For example, varieties of Cryptococcus wentii are commonly known to melt when first added to an aquarium because they lose their immersed, out-of-water grown leaves and then regrow brand new submerged form leaves. This takes up a lot of energy for the plant, so during this stage they may grow slower than usual, but once they've adapted to their submerged life, they can pick up their growth rate to a moderate speed. So this can give the impression that they are extremely low maintenance plants, and in my opinion that is partially true, but over time as they adapt they will slightly pick up their growth rate and may need trimming once every couple of months, but in the grand scheme of things that's still not much. In general though, rosette plants still have a far slower growth rate compared to most stem, stolon and floating plants found in the hobby. The good news is that many rosette plants are extremely hardy and very forgiving for beginners. This means that they can do perfectly fine in low light without CO2 injection or any liquid fertilizers or anything like that. The standard beginner-friendly recommendations for rosette plants usually come from the Echinodorus and Cryptococcus genera. When it comes to the Echinodorus genus, the Amazon sword or Echinodorus belleri is by far the most popular option in the hobby. But what a lot of beginners fail to realise is this thing is an absolute beast and it can get absolutely huge. One of my good friends has one that's easy over 50 centimeters tall now in his bigger tank. While this definitely makes it a bad choice for smaller nano tanks, it can still be an excellent beginner-friendly plant for medium to large setups. If you do keep a lot of nano tanks like myself, better options include Echinodorus tropica, which maxes out at 10 centimeters or 4 inches, or maybe something like Echinodorus aquatica, which gets to around 20 centimeters or 8 inches. For the Cryptococcus genus, the wentii species are by far the most common, at least here in Europe. Options like Cryptococcus wentii green, brown, tropica and myoya are easily found in a lot of different shops and serve as a great entry-level point for people looking to pick up their first crypts. But be careful not to get lured into the more challenging varieties such as the pink flamingo. I've seen this happen countless times, and personally I am completely against shops selling these more advanced plants to absolute beginners who see the pretty pink colour and think that that's the plant they want. It's very difficult. Avoid it. Other easy species within the Cryptocoryne genus include Beckettii, Willisii, Nurii and Crispitula, all of which I've personally kept myself and are very, very easy to keep. When it comes to propagation, most people think of the division method for rosette plants, where you wait for the plant to grow large enough for the rosette to be easily split into two pieces, giving you smaller plants. Again though, just like with rhizome plants, I honestly think this just takes way too much time, and most rosette plants in the hobby are very easy to find and very affordable, and you usually get multiple plants in a single pot. For example, a few months back I picked up a pot of Cryptocoryne Beckettii petchii and it had 11 individual plantlets in that one pot, because a lot of people think all of that plant mass is a single plant. It's not. Provided you are careful, you can separate them down into their individual plantlets, place them wherever you want them in your tank and let them grow. But it is worth keeping in mind that some varieties of rosette plants can start to send out runners the longer they've been in your tank, creating new plantlets in random places in your aquarium, but in my experience at least, this is rare and is not as common as some sources online suggest. What makes rosette plants stand out is the sheer versatility that they offer. Even just within the Echinodorus genus of plants, the size range is absolutely massive. You can find foreground, midground and background plants. Some of them can also be colourful and have hints of brown and red in them. They can have different leaf textures, so there's such a huge range, and then you've got Cryptocorynes and other types of rosette in there too. Speaking of Cryptocorynes, you can also get Cryptocoryne parva, which is absolutely tiny, and I think it's the only commonly used rosette plant that people use as a carpet. It is low-tech friendly, but it takes forever to grow, and don't get a couple of pots of this and thinking you can grow carpet. The people who share photographs and videos of this have bought either lots of it or use high-tech expensive systems with CO2 injection to grow it faster. Moving on, and we get to stem plants, which is my personal favourite type of aquatic plant because they are affordable, versatile, come in a range of different leaf colours and textures, and most of all, a lot of them are very easy to keep. Stem plants are also easy to identify because they grow from a single long stem with leaves sprouting out from either side. There is a wide range of maximum heights of stem plant in the hobby, but a lot of options that are widely available and more affordable are generally better suited to the background because they can get tall. While most people, including myself, generally plant their stem plants in the substrate, they are very, very efficient at absorbing nutrients from the water column, and I've had a few of them free floating in my tanks for quite a while without issue. In fact, some species of stem plants like hornwort have naturally evolved to be free-floating stem plants and have lost their ability to grow roots altogether. But most people will be planting these in the substrate because they are so highly efficient at water column feeding. You don't need a nutrient-rich substrate for most of these to grow. When it comes to growth rate, there are technically slow, moderate, fast and very fast plant varieties out there when it comes to the stem plant type, but the majority of them do tend to have a fast to very fast growth rate. This can be both a benefit and a challenge depending on what you specifically want for your aquarium. On the positive side, their fast growth rate helps naturally purify your aquarium water, keeping your fish safe. But the trade-off is the amount of maintenance that they need, and some varieties of stem plant can need trimming every week or two, so don't overlook that. Due to their rapid growth rate, some stem plants are also considered highly invasive and are restricted in certain countries. For example, Limnophila sessiliflora and Hygrophila polysperma, two of my favourite plants, are federally banned over in the United States, but they are very popular options here in Europe and elsewhere. The good news is that many popular stem plants thrive in low-tech setups with basic entry-level lighting, no CO2 systems and no liquid fertilizer. In my opinion, if you choose to stick to the easy to medium difficulty stem plants, then your chances of success with them are very high. But as I mentioned earlier when I was talking about Bucephalandra, One factor to consider is your water hardness, especially your carbonate hardness, because some stem plants can be more sensitive to it than other plant types. And to add to the confusion, this can also apply to different species within the exact same genus of plant. For example, Hygrophila castata prefers soft acidic water, Hygrophila deformis prefers hard alkaline water, and Hygrophila polysperma usually falls somewhere in the middle. That's why I usually recommend Hygrophila polysperma or Rotala rotundifolia to beginners, because they do well in a wide range of water parameters. Like I mentioned earlier though, if you live here in the UK, you can use the free Kinetico postcode checker tool to find out your water hardness, and I'm sure there's other options available for other countries. Propagation of stem plants couldn't be easier either, and when the stem plant grows too tall, you trim the healthy top off the top of the stem, and then if you like, you can replant it in the substrate where it will grow new roots and start growing as a brand new plant. It is worth noting that with most varieties of stem plants, 2 new stems will start to grow out of the cut point where you trimmed it, and that can quickly increase the amount of plant mass and nutrient demand in your tank. To manage this, some people will physically remove the entire stem plant from their tank every time it needs trimming, then they'll take off the top of the stem plant and just replant that part of it and compost or bin the rest. Not only does this avoid the problem of multiple stems growing from each cut point that you have on your stems, but it can also give you an advantage when keeping red plants in a low-tech tank. That's because you're replanting the tops of those red stem plants that have the majority of the anthocyanin built up in it already, so it'll hold their red colour, instead of you trimming that part off, disposing of it and exposing the less colourful parts and needing to reset your tank every few weeks. When it comes to beginner-friendly recommendations, this is going to depend on exactly what you want from your stem plants. If you're looking for compact stems for the foreground of your tank, then Sterigani repens, Rotala bonsai or Bacopa compact are excellent, easy to keep options. Something like Bacopa caroliniana can work well in the midground because it has a very slow growth rate compared to most other popular stem plants in the hobby. Faster, taller species are also great for the background, like Hygrophila polysperma, Limnophila sessiliflora, water sprite and other things like that. Then we have pearlweed, which is probably the most versatile stem plant in the hobby, but it can require a lot of maintenance to get it to do what you want. That's why I just keep it in pearlweed only tanks, leave it to grow and do its thing, because it does want to try and take over the entire tank. When it comes to use cases, in my opinion, most people, even if they are not aware of it, use their stem plants to help naturally balance their water and keep their fish safe, because these can use up an absolute ton of toxins. Then they'll convert them into nutrients for the plants and use it for growth. But when planted in clusters, they can also create dense cover for your fish and offer shrimp and snails grazing areas. Next up are Stolon plants, and while there are a small number of unique looking ones, the majority of these have a grass-like looking long blade-shaped leaf. Stolon plants are usually very straightforward to grow, you just plant them in the substrate and leave them to do their thing. The catch is that if you leave them unchecked, some species will quickly take over your tank, since they can grow at a rapid pace in the right setup. When it comes to maximum height, there are a few different options available in the hobby today, but we do have to factor in lighting to get the best out of these plants. Taller species like the more commonly available Vallisneria varieties in the hobby can do well under entry-level stock lights and still get some decent growth. But for the shorter carpeting species, personally I would recommend you get yourself an entry-level affordable dedicated plant light. Personally, I recommend and use the Ciora SR616. I use it on a ton of my tanks. If you're familiar with my channel, you see them all the time. It's not something I'm paid to promote. I bought them with my own money and I use them on a lot of setups. Technically, you can come up with your own photo period, which means how long you have your light on and at what strength, but personally I leave all but one of them at maximum intensity for 6 hours per day set by the controller unit, and I let the included timer do the rest. I will leave an affiliate link in the video description for anyone who wants to check it out, but there's plenty of low-tech friendly lights on the market right now. I just think that's the most affordable one that can grow carpeting plants. Now the reason that a better light matters so much for the shorter carpeting varieties of Stolon plants is that the usable light for photosynthesis has to penetrate all the way through the water column to the top of your substrate where that plant will sit. Stock lights on entry-level kit tanks are usually nowhere near strong enough to do this, so people spend money on these shorter carpeting plants for them just to end up melting because the light is not strong enough to keep them going. Thankfully though, because LED technology is advancing at such a rapid pace, you can get some entry-level lights these days that are more than capable of growing a lot of the easy category carpeting Stolon plants. On top of that, I don't use any CO2 injection or liquid fertilizers for mine. I use the fish poop fertilization method. The most important thing in my experience, with the easy category ones at least, is the lighting unit. So when it comes to beginner friendly options for this one, I'm going to break it down into different tank placements to keep it as easy as possible. When it comes to the background, the taller varieties of Vallisneria will probably be your best bet, but full disclosure, I haven't kept any of the taller varieties of Val yet, so I am going on second-hand information for that. When it comes to the mid-ground, the shorter varieties of Vallisneria such as Vallisneria asiatica or Vallisneria nana are good options, and I've kept both of them and I do want both of them in future setups again. When it comes to foreground carpeting Stolon plants, my top recommendation is Helenthium telanum green. I honestly, hand on heart, think this is the easiest carpeting plant in the hobby for low-tech planted tanks by far. Other solid options include Eliocharis, also known as dwarf hairgrass, and Marcellia hirsutra, which have also been easier to grow but in my experience have a far slower growth rate than Helenthium telanum green. I also want to quickly talk about Sagittaria subgelata, commonly known as dwarf Sagittaria, because this can work as a foreground or mid-ground plant depending on your tank size, but it does have a very unpredictable maximum height, so personally I wouldn't recommend it for smaller tanks, and I'm not a big fan of it if I'm honest because it's just so unpredictable. Propagation for Stolon plants is automatic, and they will just simply send out runners and produce new plantlets over time and gradually fill out your aquarium. Now this can be an excellent feature of Stolon plants if you want an extremely affordable one-tank plant where you literally add the plants and just leave them to take over and wait for it to all fill in, but this definitely is a challenge if you're trying to maintain a carefully planned aquascape. For the shorter carpeting varieties of Stolon plants like Helenthium telanum green, this really isn't an issue because they don't get very tall, but as you can see in this tank, the dwarf Sagittaria that I put in the back left corner has started to spread. Currently, I have one dwarf Sagittaria plantlet popping up in the foreground, there's one in the middle of my Hygrophila 53B cluster, and there's a few others popping up, so it increases the maintenance of the tank. This is why I'm really not a big fan of Stolon plants, because you need to manage both their vertical growth like a stem plant, but also their horizontal spread via their runners, and it just increases maintenance. When it comes to use cases, Stolon plants can be very flexible depending on the specific ones you get. For me, the carpeting options are their main strength by far, and I do plan to get more of them in the future. But you can also set them up as one-plant tanks with Vallisneria or dwarf Sagittaria like I have with dwarf Sag in this shrimp jar, where I just leave it to take over as it grows and do its thing. There's no other plants in there for me to worry about. Once they've grown in as well, the taller or mid-ground options can offer hiding spots for your fish, and all of them offer surface area for your shrimp and snails to graze. Moving on, and we get to floating plants, and I actually have a dedicated article about these that goes into far more detail, which I link to in the description. As the name suggests, most floating plants rest on the surface of your aquarium water, but there are technically some exceptions. As I mentioned earlier in the stem plant section, hornwort has evolved to lose its ability to grow roots, so it's technically a free-floating stem plant that will drift in the upper third of your tank depending on the situation. Stem plants typically have a fast to very fast growth rate depending on the setup. While this does mean more maintenance is usually required since there's more excess plant mass to remove, it also means that they are excellent options for stabilising your tank's water parameters, keeping things safe and stable for your fish, shrimp and snails. On top of that, if you leave your floating plants to carpet the surface, then they can help with light penetration while also outcompeting algae for nutrients, helping to counter algae growth. Because they grow on the surface of your aquarium water closest to your light, they usually do very well under low-powered lighting. On top of that, they also have direct access to atmospheric CO2, bypassing one of the main growth factor limitations for submerged plants in low-tech tanks. While floating plants can have a rapid growth rate, they are still generally fine with the fish poop fertilization method, and that's all I use with them in my tanks, removing the need for liquid fertilizers. The main thing to watch out for with floating plants is overgrowth if you don't trim them every couple of weeks, because they can end up blocking out light from reaching your submerged plants, potentially causing them issues. Thankfully, maintenance is extremely easy if you go out and get yourself an affordable hair comb, and it quickly lets you skim off the excess plant mass every week or two depending on growth rate in your setup. When it comes to beginner-friendly options, there are plenty of them out there. Personally though, in my experience, Salvinia minima and Salvinia auriculata have easily been the most hardy and beginner-friendly floating plants I've ever kept. A common issue that people have with hang-on-back filters is that the spillway which returns the water to the tank will dunk their floating plants into the water and cause them to melt, but I've had both Salvinia minima and Salvinia auriculata in tanks with hang-on-back filters where the plants were dunked and they did not melt. Other common challenges for most stem plants include snails eating their roots, high humidity if your aquarium has a tightly fitted lid, or strong water flow near the roots of the plants at the surface. That can potentially cause issues for other beginner-friendly floating plants such as Amazon frogbit, water lettuce, Spirodella polyrhiza, or Lemna minor. In my experience, red root floaters and hornwort are a level below them when it comes to how beginner-friendly they can be because they are more temperamental. Red root floaters in particular are more prone to melting even if a little bit of water splashes on them from a sponge filter or an air stone or something like that, and in my experience, hornwort can seemingly randomly decide to just drop all of its leaves because it didn't like a water parameter change. So just to recap that, Salvinia minima or Salvinia auriculata would be my recommendations, but Amazon frogbit, water lettuce, Spirodella polyrhiza and Lemna minor are also very easy to keep in my experience. Propagation for floating plants is just as easy as with Stolon plants, and technically some of them could be classed as Stolon plants because they propagate via sending out runners. So just leave them to do their thing on the surface of your tank and you'll quickly end up with a lot of excess plant mass. When it comes to use cases, the main role for floating plants in most people's aquarium, even if they don't realise it, is natural water purification. Species like Lemna minor, water lettuce and Spirodella polyrhiza have plenty of research backing up their ability to absorb a lot of excess toxins in the water and use them as nutrients to support plant growth. But in reality, all varieties of floating plants will offer these benefits to your tank, helping to remove excess toxins that can be a very common beginner mistake and help keep your fish safe. The other big reason that I personally keep floating plants is due to their aesthetics, because some options do have a unique look to them that can help enhance certain aquascapes. For example, water lettuce and Amazon frogbit can have far longer roots than average when it comes to other floating plants, and my Amazon frogbit can easily grow 30cm long roots in a week. If you're trying to keep a jungle-style aquascape like my betta fish tank, this can simulate vines hanging from trees and add that next level of detail to the setup. Red root floaters are another very popular choice in the hobby because people see the photographs and videos online of their beautiful red leaves, but this is more challenging to achieve in low-tech planted tanks. You can get some red hues in a low-tech tank, but getting the entire leaf cluster to turn bright red like you see on some high-tech aquascaping channels is definitely more difficult, and in my experience and my opinion is not realistic for a low-tech tank. Next up we have carpeting plants, and technically this isn't a plant type rather than a use case, but since they are so popular I think they deserve their own section in the video. Now there's a very common myth that carpeting plants don't work in low-tech tanks, and that's just not true. They can work very well, in fact, provided you get the right setup. As I mentioned earlier when talking about the shorter Stolon plants in the hobby, in my opinion, the most important thing for carpeting plants in a low-tech setup is your light. I've honestly lost count of how many people have reached out to me for help with their carpeting plants in low-tech tanks, and when I ask what light they're using, they are using an entry-level, very low-powered stock light that came with their tank, which is designed to illuminate their fish rather than to support healthy plant growth. As I mentioned earlier, the further the light has to travel from the light source, the weaker it gets, especially in an aquarium because the water refracts light away from the actual target, unlike an atmospheric plant like a house plant or something like that. As I mentioned earlier, personally, my entry-level recommendation is the Sciora SR616 light. I use a ton of them, I've used them for literally years, very big fan, affiliate link in the description. If you want a little bit more power without spending much more money, then the Haiger 957 is a solid upgrade, but both Haiger and Sciora are currently rolling out their new lights, which will probably replace the Haiger 957 with better functionality. I also have an article going over low-tech friendly carpeting plants that I link to in the video description that goes into a lot more detail. So with that out of the way, carpeting plants are usually placed in the substrate in the foreground of your tank, but depending on your specific aquascape, they may be used in other areas as well. One exception to the traditional carpeting plants is moss mats, and I also have an article going over how you create these that I link to in the description, but in short, you get a stainless steel aquarium grid or a plastic crafting mesh mat or something like that. Put some moss on the top of it, wrap thread around it to hold it in place, and you'll place those grids where you want the moss to grow in your tank. Growth rates for carpeting plants in low-tech tanks will depend on different factors such as the specific species of plant you have, the lighting unit you have, the available nutrients, and your water hardness level. When it gets to beginner-friendly carpeting options, especially ones that are low-tech friendly, like I mentioned earlier, Helenthium Telenum Green is my #1 recommendation. Time and time again, this is a plant I recommend to people new to the hobby. But it does come with a caveat, because in around 50% of the tanks I've personally used it in, the immersed out-of-water leaves will decide to melt back and then new submerged growth will start to take off from the plant. But a lot of beginners, especially if it's their first tank, worry they've done something wrong when it starts to melt, remove it and give up, leave it in the tank for a couple of months just to see if you get that new growth. Most people should see new sprouts within 6 weeks, if not sooner. Other great beginner-friendly options for low-tech tanks include Eliocharis parvula, Littorella uniflora and Marcellia hirsutra. Those are just the beginner-friendly ones I've personally kept, but there are other options out there too. If you're going to choose the moss mat route, then I'd recommend avoiding Java moss personally, just because it tends to grow outwards in every direction, including vertically, given the carpet and messy look. I'd lean more towards either Taiwan moss, which is probably the easiest variety of moss I've ever kept, or something like Christmas moss, which I've got in the mid-ground of my guppy tank, which looks amazing, but it does tend to need a little bit stronger light to make it grow well. And as I mentioned in the Rosette Plants section, Cryptococcine parva is sometimes used as a carpet, but in a low-tech tank it's just not worth it in my opinion. It can definitely work, but this is one of the slowest growing plants I've ever kept, by far, even slower than Anubias, and to get that entire carpet to grow out, it's just going to take way too long. So moving on, and we get to red plants, and just like carpeting plants, this isn't a specific type of plant but more of an aesthetic use case, but I did think it'd be useful to include them because so many people want red plants in their tanks right now. The thing with red plants is that a lot of their initial care at least will depend on the specific option you get, whether it's a red stem, rosette, bulb or floating plant or something else. Basically apply the care needs that I've mentioned for that specific category as well as anything I do in this one. Again, placement, planting and growth rate will all depend on the specific red type plant you get. Similar to what I mentioned with carpeting plants, where red plants really differ from green plants is with their lighting requirements. In my opinion, this is the most common challenge people run into when trying to grow red plants in low-tech setups. That's because the red coloration in these specific plants comes from a shift in the ratio between chlorophyll and anthocyanin. That's why so many red plants that you buy from the shops are still green at first, because their leaves are still full of chlorophyll and have no anthocyanin development yet. But once kept under higher intensity lighting, they start to produce more and more anthocyanin as a stress response to try and protect themselves from the stronger light, which shifts their pigment balance from green to red. Depending on the exact red plant you're keeping, you may be able to enhance the red coloration further by keeping nitrate levels below 5 ppm in your tank. So now we get to the main challenge of keeping red plants in low-tech beginner tanks. Without CO2 injection, a lot of plants in the hobby, be them red or green, will reach their light saturation point early in the day when under a higher intensity light. Once that happens, the excess photons from the light can't be used efficiently by the plants, so they essentially bounce around the tank until algae picks them up and uses them for fuel, and there's an algae bloom. This is why red plants are far more commonly used in high-tech setups where there's a CO2 system running to enhance the growth rate of the plant, which also lets them use up more photons, reducing algae growth. That said, there are still some red plants in the hobby that can work well in beginner-friendly tanks, but in my opinion, if it's your very first planted tank, I wouldn't recommend them. You're going to have a lot to learn just with green plants. In my area, the most beginner-friendly options are Rotala Blood Red, Ludwigia palustrus Red, Ludwigia repens Rubin, Red Tiger Lotus, and to some extent Red Root Floaters. I also want to stress that you might see a lot of photographs or videos online of other red plants. For example, Althananthera renickii is a very popular one on the high-tech side of the hobby. It gets absolutely gorgeous deep red hues, but in low-tech tanks it's probably going to have a brown or orange hue to it, and in some low-tech tanks, if your light's not powerful enough, it's just going to melt away and rot. So like I said, if you're brand new to the planted tank side of the hobby, stick with green plants, at least for your first tank, at least for 6 months until you learn the basics, and then maybe consider trying some red plants, but they are definitely more challenging. So moving on, and we get to moss, and just like Rhizome Plants, moss is also an epiphyte that is usually mounted to hardscape, decorations or moss mats depending on your specific setup. There's a bunch of different ways to apply moss as needed in your tank, with thread, fishing line and aquarium safe glue being the most common. That said, moss can sometimes be a bit of a beginner trap in my opinion. While a lot of moss varieties are very easy to keep alive, it can be surprisingly high maintenance when it actually comes time to trim it. Any loose strands of moss left floating around your tank after a trim can settle in random places, anchor onto that hardscape and start to grow in an unintended area. I've literally had moss slowly overtake some of my older tanks because I didn't personally realise this was a thing, and then you just end up with moss growing from different areas, which you then have to trim that moss as well. Then you've got more fibres floating around in your water, and it slowly just anchors on and keeps growing. One clever strategy that I first saw on the Bio Lily channel, I'm not sure if she came up with it or got it from somewhere else, is to mount your moss onto a small pebble or a ceramic plant ring, and then you place that in the areas where you want your moss. Then when it's time for maintenance, you can simply remove that small pebble or your ceramic ring, take the moss out of the water, out of your aquarium and do the trimming there. Rinse it off outside of the aquarium in case there's any loose strands of moss on it, and then you replace it back. Thankfully, moss is extremely slow grown, so it is rare that you have to trim it, but in my opinion it really is a pain, and a lot of beginners don't realise how much of a pain it is until they start to have moss grown in random places in their aquarium. I've also lost count of the number of people I've had comment on videos or DM me on social media thinking that their moss is dying because it grows so slow compared to other plants, but as long as there's some dark green colour on there and it's not turning brown, I honestly think it's probably going to be fine. Personally, I've only kept 3 varieties of moss so far, but all of them have done very well under the entry-level Ciora SR616 light I mentioned earlier, but I don't think I've ever kept any of them under anything lower powered than that. And even though some plant nurseries do say you need CO2 and liquid fertilizers for some of these moss varieties, in my experience you really don't, and I don't use them. Out of the ones I've personally kept, I do think Taiwan moss is the easiest, and then slightly after that is Java moss, and then a little bit more behind that is Christmas moss, and with Christmas moss I do think you definitely need a light designed for plants. One important clarification is that the hobby actually has 2 different plants commonly sold under the common name Java moss. The one I've personally kept is Taxiphyllum barbari, which is very hardy and very easy to keep in my experience. Then there's Vesicularia dubiana, which also shares the common name Java moss. If you have soft water, it probably doesn't matter which variety you get, but if you have harder water, Vesicularia dubiana might just melt away and fail. So if you do choose Java moss, double check the Latin name. Taxiphyllum barbari has the wider range of water parameters and is the easiest one to keep. When it comes to propagation, I'd actually argue that moss is too easy to propagate. Like I mentioned earlier, the tiniest little moss fibre left stray in your water column can anchor to the hardscape and grow. MJ Aquascapes has even blended moss in a kitchen blender, painted it onto hardscape with a brush and left it to grow, and even after being blended, it still grew perfectly well. When it comes to use cases, most people tend to use moss for its aesthetic purposes to add that unique look to a lot of aquariums popularised by Takashi Amano's nature tankscapes. But if you're on the shrimp keeping side of the hobby, moss becomes extremely valuable because it offers a ton of surface area for biofilm and microalgae to grow on top of it. Then your shrimp colony can go across the top of your moss and pick at all of this biofilm and microalgae and eat it as a naturally grown food source. Moving on, and I want to talk about bulb plants, and full disclosure, I really don't have much experience with these. I've literally only kept 1, but I will share what I've learned. And I'm using old footage from last year, so that's why my 40-gallon tank looks different, but I'll explain why I'm doing that for this section as we work through it. Bulb plants are very easy to identify because they literally grow out of a bulb with the stem sprouting upward and leaves developing from the ends. I kept green tiger lotus in one of my tanks last year, and during a rescape a few months ago I thought I removed it. But at least 1 bulb is still in the back of my 40-gallon tank, and it's starting to send up new leaves as we speak, as you can see in this footage, but because it's tiny I'm using older footage where the older green tiger lotus had fully grown out. Planting advice for bulb plants is all over the place online, and I mean even reputable plant nurseries offer different advice on what you're meant to do with the bulb. In all honesty, I don't know who's right. What I personally did was take the bulb, push it about halfway into the substrate, and I just left it to do its thing. For around 6 weeks I was worried that I did something wrong and the bulb had just melted away, but sure enough, after around 6 weeks I did start to see it throwing up leaves, and I was actually very surprised by how quickly they grew once established. My green tiger lotus did very well under my entry-level low-tech lights. They didn't require CO2 injection or liquid fertilizers, and I'm confident that the other easy category tiger lotus plants on the market will be the same. Propagation with tiger lotus is the same as Stolon plants. That bulb is going to send out runners surprisingly fast because I only had it in my tank for around 8 months last year at most. When I removed the main plant, I think I removed 12 individual bulbs, but as I showed earlier, there's still at least 1 more in there. Now, I've never kept a Ponegeton in any of my tanks, and I'm not even sure if there's any easy category versions of it, but that is another very popular bulb plant on the hobby. Like I said, no experience with it, so I won't mention it any further. The main use case for bulb plants in the hobby is purely aesthetic in my opinion, and I do like the look of the lilies on the surface, but I just wish those bulbs didn't send out so many runners because it does become a pain. Finally, I want to touch on using houseplants in aquariums, and this has been growing in popularity over the last year or 2. It's something I am personally new to, but it's definitely something that I'm going to use more in my tanks in the future. The concept for this is very simple, and you secure certain houseplants to the back or sides of your aquarium and let their roots dangle into the water for them to grow. Personally, I use 3D printed holders that let me secure the plants in place but will also secure a light for the plants to grow, and my friend makes these and sells them on his Etsy page, MMS Design Concepts, but I link to it in the description. That said, you don't need these fancy holders. I've literally seen people on TikTok bend paper clips into shapes where they'll hold the plant into the water, so that can work too. Growth rates will depend on the specific species of houseplant that you choose, but some of them grow surprisingly fast just because they have easy access to atmospheric CO2, but unlike floating plants, they shouldn't be risking any light penetration issues because they grow on the sides and back going up and out. The two fastest growing houseplants I've personally kept like this are Tradescantia and Pothos. These two grow extremely fast, and I honestly think you might be shocked if you are new to this method of keeping houseplants. Fittonia is definitely on the slower side, but it comes in such a beautiful wide range of colours for different colour pops it can be a big hit. Then we have things like Spider Plant and Polka Dot Plant that have a moderate growth rate in my experience. Lighting can be a factor for houseplants depending on your specific setup. Personally, I use affordable grow lights off Amazon designed for houseplants, and I place them above the aquarium to supplement the light because my houseplants grow above my main aquarium light. Because they draw CO2 directly from the atmosphere and absorb nutrients from their roots in the water column, they shouldn't need any liquid fertilization or anything like that, but they can help remove a lot of toxins and use them as nutrients for plant growth. So just like the fast-growing stems, Stolon and floating plants, things like Tradescantia and Pothos can help keep your fish safe with their rapid growth rate. As I said, I am new to this, but I've tried a few different houseplants, and the most beginner-friendly options I've tried include Tradescantia, Spider Plant, Polka Dot Plant, Fittonia, Monstera, Peace Lily and Pothos, but there's plenty of other options out there too that other creators have spoken around. Propagation will depend on the specific plant you choose, but a lot of these are very easy to multiply. For example, Tradescantia and Pothos are stem plants. You simply trim them and put the cutting back into the water so it can develop roots and grow. One thing I would caution about is using too many of the faster grown varieties of houseplant. I do think that caused a problem in one of my tanks where they were taking out too many nutrients and causing problems for my submerged plants, but with slow grown or more balanced planting styles you shouldn't be having an issue. For me, the biggest advantage of using houseplants like this is purely aesthetic. They let you add a wide range of unique leaf shapes, colours and leaf textures above the waterline, adding to that junglescape look that I personally love. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end. I know it was a long one. I hope it's been helpful and cleared a few things up. Thanks for watching and good luck with your planted tanks.